Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM. Welcome back to the Schools Counselors Collaborative here at MTSU's College of Education. We have a session now from Dr. April Ebinger, who is the Director of School Psychology Services at the Tennessee Department of Education. Dr. Ebinger has brought a session to us today, Section 504, What School Counselors Need to Know. So we all have this in our schools, so this is going to be really helpful and widely applicable. So Dr. Ebinger, welcome.
Thank you.
And so please.
Thank you for having me this morning, afternoon, I believe it is almost now. You're probably wondering, why is a school psychologist telling me anything about Section 504? Well, we don't really have anybody at the State Department who specializes in Section 504. So when I showed up one day at the department, they said, "Hey, April, guess what?" And now I feel like a school counselor, because isn't that what happens to you almost every day? Hey, guess what you're going to absorb? How many of you have taken a 504 class when you were in college? Some of you? That's amazing. Usually the answer is 0. So you showed up at your first job and they said, "You're going to be the 504 coordinator." And most of you said, "Well, what's that?" Right? And it's a very legally binding process, right? Very similar to an IEP process. And we often, especially in the state of Tennessee, don't equip school counselors to take on that work and to do it in the way that it really needs to be done. So if you don't know me, April Ebinger, I'm the Director of School Psych. I oversee a number of different buckets of work, not just school psychology services around eligibility evaluation, Section 504, the programming side of it, mental health for our students with disabilities. So I love the last session. I thought that was very timely. And I do all things with behavior. So we're going to do some updates once I'm done around the department, but very excited to be here. I always love working with my school counselors. I don't think I would be as good of a school psychologist if I didn't have fantastic school counselors working with me. So very excited for you guys to be here in person and virtually. So what do you need to know? We're going to go through all of our different buckets of requirements, from what the legalities are of Section 504 to how do you deal with the parent who refers and nobody suspects a disability. Parents show up with medical diagnoses. Don't they love to do this? Now, what do you do with it? How do you do a 504 evaluation? How do you determine if that impairment substantially impacts a major life activity? All of that is resting on your shoulders, isn't it? So we're going to walk through all of that today. I know a lot of you are going to have questions. Feel free to jot those down, put them in the chat box virtually. A lot of times I can preempt the questions you're going to ask, and as we go through our presentation, I may be able to get to those. And at the end, if we don't, if I haven't covered that question, please feel free to ask once we get through the content. Fair? Okay. All right, this is our strategic plan for the Department of Education. When I think about Section 504, for me it is really all about access. It is an access law. All right, it is an anti-discrimination law that is about giving students, people with disabilities, access, equitable access. And that's what we're really going to talk about today, because I think a lot of people assume 504 is just about accommodations. They just need extended time, right? It is so much bigger than that, okay? So much bigger than that. So we know that this is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That graphic that you see there is a very famous graphic where we look at the difference between equality and equity, right? If we give all of our students the exact same thing, we're going to get typically the exact same results, as opposed to the equity piece where we meet those kids where they are and we determine what each individual student needs in order to make progress, right? And a big part of this too, and I'm going to show you a different graphic in a moment, is the majority of our students who are served under IEPs are also protected under Section 504. okay? I answer questions almost weekly about, can a student have an IEP and a 504 plan? We're going to talk about that. So keep in mind, this is an anti-discrimination law. So think through when we started having a lot of our special education laws pushed out. 1975 was one of our first. And when we start to think about access and what we're providing at a school level, it wasn't until the early 80s when we're actually educating students with disabilities in the same buildings as other typical peers. Many of you, some of you, right, maybe were alive then, and it has increased substantially from there. So access, keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward with this. So who must comply? Anyone who receives federal funding. So a lot of times we'll get questions around, well, my child is attending XYZ private school. Well, do they receive federal funds? If the answer is no, they are not bound by Section 504, okay? They don't have to provide the same level of access, right? They're not going to be held to the same discrimination, harassment, bullying type of requirements that we would in a public school setting. So all public schools, the Department of Ed, all of those must comply with Section 504, and there must be a 504 coordinator, right? That's probably what you've been designated in your buildings. I'm assuming, are all of you considered your 504 coordinators in your buildings? The majority of you are? Okay. So we're going to talk about the differences too. I would say one of the biggest basis for OCR complaints, Office of Civil Rights complaints, or administrative complaints under IDA at the state level has to do with child fine. You guys know you also have child fine obligations, which we're going to talk about in a moment, but Section 504 is a little stickier there, okay? Because often what we don't know to do is it a 504 issue or is it an IDA issue? How do we differentiate, right? We're going to get into that. We do know that IDA requires that the student have that qualifying disability. There's that two-pronged approach. Do they meet criteria in one of our 16 categories, okay? And then do they have that adverse educational impact, all right? Under 504, we're not asking those questions, are we? We're saying, do they have a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, okay? And then 504, again, is going to be protecting any of those qualified students under that IEP. I love this graphic because I talk about it a lot, these circles. We have all of the students in this large blue circle here. And then here are 504 students who are covered, the smaller subset, right? And now keep in mind, students who have a mental or physical impairment may not qualify for a quote-unquote 504 plan, but they still may be provided the protections under 504, all right? So keep that in mind too as you're educating your teachers in your buildings about who is protected under 504 and what those protections look like. And then we get even more specific here, and then we're talking about students with an IEP is even smaller. So as we look at this graphic, you'll know that the students with the IEP are inside the circles for students with a 504, right? But what happens if you evaluate and maybe the student doesn't qualify for an IEP, or what happens if the student previously qualified is no longer eligible? Where do we step back into? 504 land. There's an Office of Civil Rights complaint out of West Tennessee, I believe it was about a year ago, where a student no longer qualified under an IDA category, and the team did not consider is the key word here, if a 504 evaluation would be appropriate. So when we leave IDA land, we're stepping right back into 504 land. Our obligation is not to hand the kid a 504 that day, right? It is to consider if it would be appropriate for a 504 evaluation. I think often what happens too, and this is on my side of things, I see in IDA meetings where the student doesn't qualify and they're like, well, how about you just go ask for a 504? It's not as simple as that, right, school counselors? Absolutely not. You still are bound to do an evaluation to determine if they're eligible. And so we often use 504s as consolation prizes, don't we? Oh, you didn't qualify for this, but guess what? You can get this. It's not that simple. And so we don't want to lessen the magnitude of what it means to still qualify for a 504 plan either. So keep that in mind as we're going through this, that you need to be looped in to those students in your building who potentially are being evaluated who didn't qualify, or who may be dismissed from IDA for whatever reason. It doesn't happen a lot, right? It doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, you guys need to be looped into those situations. So who's covered? Who's covered? Has a record of such impairment, right? What does that mean? Has a record. Maybe it is some medical information that was provided when the student originally enrolled at the school, that there was some knowledge of whatever impairment it could be, whether it's a medical condition, a mental health condition, physical condition, or the student has a physical or mental impairment, right? Typically, parents are going to let you know that. They're going to bring that diagnosis, that prescription pad from the doctor saying you need a 504 to your office. And then the third one is regarding as having such an impairment. Now that's a sticky one, isn't it? This is when I'm training on 504s, I tell the attendees all the time, if you don't get to stand up in front of your staff every year and train them on 504, I would make sure you get that face time with them. Because number 3 is the critical piece here. Have you ever heard teachers in the workroom saying, man, Johnny is so ADHD. I just can't, he is just running around like oh my goodness, I can't keep him focused. Did you just regard Johnny as having a mental or physical impairment? Could he now be covered and protected under Section 504? How we talk about kids matters, right? How we talk about kids matters. And how we talk about ourselves in those moments. When we get to the section on bullying and harassment, if I'm going to make any type of pejorative joke about my OCD or how anxious and have anxiety, whatever that joke may be, we could now be marginalizing somebody in the back of the room who has OCD or anxiety that we don't know about, okay? So how we talk about kids matters. So when you have a teacher come into your office and say, I need you to evaluate, Johnny, I always use Johnny, I apologize, hopefully there's no Johnnies in the room. I need you to evaluate Johnny for ADHD or for a 504 plan. We always need to be cautious and remind teachers that they're not eligible to make that diagnosis, right? We're going to talk about strengths and weaknesses of our students. What do you see? What do you observe, right? And what, as Dr. Wilson mentioned before, what data do you have to support this position? What data do you have to support this position? And I would tell my teachers, if you're going to come and have me schedule a support team meeting, because you have concerns, that teacher better have already talked to those parents about their concerns, because you shouldn't be the first person calling home and sharing concerns. I shouldn't be the first person calling home saying, I'm going to test your kid for disability, okay? But the teacher has the obligation to bring to that support team meeting the data that supports that suspicion of a disability. That's not on you initially to provide that. Your teacher needs to have that ready for you, okay? So has a record, has that impairment, or is regarded as having that, okay? So who gets a 504? We know that any student with that physical or mental impairment that substantially limits, that's the hard one, isn't it? How do we measure something when my definition of substantially may be moderately to you, right? We have to have good data and through our evaluation process to help answer these questions, but thank goodness we have a 504 team that's going to support us in this process. It's not just you doing this work alone and not just you making these decisions. Again, all of these decisions about referring, evaluation, eligibility should be made on a case-by-case basis. Not every student who has ADHD needs a 504 plan. Have that conversation with some of your parents, right? Not every student who has dyslexia, not every student who has diabetes. I'm trying to think of the most popular ones. Not every student who has seizures or migraines. Am I hitting the big ones there? Needs a 504 plan. What is our obligation? To consider a 504 plan, okay? And if, we're going to talk a little bit more about individual health plans as we go through this, but if an individual health plan is appropriate on its own, after you've considered a 504, you can certainly do that. But our obligation is to consider that request, consider if it's appropriate to move forward with a 504 evaluation. Again, if not, we say the majority, if not all, of students with IEPs will be covered under this as well. So look at this profile, and I know that we have some folks on virtual call and face-to-face, so just think for a moment, if I said that this student was struggling, they were saying that it was too hard in class, they were struggling to focus on assignments, they kind of appeared to be out in la-la land, may not take part in activities, they're not participating, they're not raising their hand, they're not collaborating with their friends in their groups. If I asked you to give me some guesses as to what diagnosis could be underlying these symptoms, I probably would get a bunch of different answers, right? We could probably say, okay, maybe it's attention deficit, right? Could it be a myriad of other things? Could it be depression? Could it be anxiety? Absolutely. Could it be some type of antisocial thing that's happening? Sure. Could it be a learning disability? Absolutely. Could it just be that maybe, going back to examples, parents are getting divorced, they're fighting a lot, they're keeping you up late at night, and coming to school is just not a priority? It could be any of those, plus probably many more examples, right? Our obligation as those 504 coordinators is to consider if a 504 is appropriate, and then start to think through what data do I need to collect in order to say which of these mental impairments could possibly be at play here. We're not asking you to diagnose, we're asking you to look for characteristics, for patterns, for some other documentation of how the student is performing to give you some insight. Look at this profile. So maybe absent frequently, frequent restroom breaks, they gotta go to the bathroom, every hour on the hour, or they take a little bit longer in the restroom, and then may leave school early, often, right? We could probably talk about a variety of other physical impairments that may be at play here. Maybe there's some gastrointestinal issue, right? IBS, Crohn's disease. But could this also be a mental impairment? Student who's trying to escape. Maybe there is some anxiety, depression going on, right? Could also be a learning disability because they don't want to stay in school because they are not good at whatever content area that we're talking about. Could be a variety of things. The key in either of these profiles, as I always joke, that a whole adage in the airport, when you see something, say something, you gotta teach your teachers to do that. Because who's gonna know that these symptoms are happening? You may know, especially if, they give you attendance and truancy, right? Do they do that to you too? If they do that, you may know about student number 2, but would you know about student number 1? You may or you may not. You have to equip your teachers that when they see something off or they notice something off about their students, that they say something about it, either to you, or they call home and investigate further, or if there's another mechanism, maybe it's not coming directly to you, but maybe they have a data team meeting, a referral team meeting, whatever that looks like. But you guys, if you train your teachers when they see things like this to say something about it, you're going to do much better on the back end of child find and ensuring that you are considering all of these students for potential 504s. So let's talk about differences with IDEA. General purpose, we know that 504 is really about that anti-discrimination. We've said that several times now. IDEA is federally funded. Section 504 is not, which is another issue, isn't it? Right? You guys have a lot of things on your plate in addition to 504, but because it's not funded, there are some issues there. Qualifying disabilities, you know that we have 14 federal plus 2 state eligibility categories under IDEA. The state ones are functional delay and intellectually gifted, okay? And then again, the qualifying disabilities under 504, that's the hard thing about Section 504 is there's a very low bar, very low bar. When we think about qualifying to have a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, that bar is very low, and it's very low for a reason. One, to ensure that equity across all disability categories, but especially on the mental health side, we have something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, right? That lists all of our psychiatric disorders. I mean, we're on the, fifth edition? So every time that is repurposed and renewed, essentially, a new edition comes out, we have new categories, don't we? New one was the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder that came out with the fifth edition. DMDD, right? We have new things that pop up. After COVID, now we have something called long COVID, don't we? As we are evolving and we either understand illness or various impairments, our understanding may change and it may increase the scope of who could qualify under Section 504. So again, that bar, that threshold is very low for 504, and it is that way for a reason. We talk a lot in IDA about FAPE, free and appropriate public education, but guess what? 504 has a FAPE clause too. Wow, I didn't know that. They are still provided that free and appropriate public education. The big difference is that when we talk about IDEA students, we're not going to say that a student who has a significant cognitive disability is going to be able to make the same growth over the course of one school year that potentially a student with a specific learning disability. We're going to meet them where they are, and we're going to set goals so they can make reasonable progress in the light of their unique circumstances, is how the law reads. So we're going to take them from wherever they are, and we're going to judge them based on what they can or cannot accomplish, and then we're going to make sure that we're pushing them and making reasonable progress towards our IEP goals. You'll notice the big difference here for 504 is it means an education comparable to non-disabled peers. Not more, right? Okay, not less, but comparable. So this is the conversation we often have when parents come to you and they say, my student's been diagnosed with XYZ disorder, but I want them to have read aloud and extended time, right? The comparable to non-disabled peers, and we're going to dig into especially those two things, because I know those are the ones that are requested most often, and how you would evaluate to either judge to include those or not. So again, eligibility for services, it's that two-pronged approach under IDA, where do they meet criteria for that disabling condition, and do they have that adverse impact educationally? We're not looking at that for eligibility services for 504. We're looking at major life activity. How is that major life activity impacted, right? Accessibility, IDA doesn't explicitly talk about it, 504 does. We're going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about accessibility. When your principals are scheduling out field trips, are they accessible for all of your students in your buildings? Can they navigate, if you're going to go on a nature hike, can they navigate the trails if they're in a wheelchair? Do they have the same opportunity to be a part of the chess club? I'm making that up. Or the cheerleading squad? Access. Not just our physical buildings, but the programs and sports teams that we support through our schools, do they have the same access? Reevaluations. Under IDEA, many of you know this because you guys are experts in all things, we are required at least once every 3 years to reevaluate. What does it say about you? It just says periodically. What does that mean? Periodically for me could be every year, every 3 years, every 5 years. Where there's ambiguity in Section 504 law, we lean into what IDA requires. So you guys, bare minimum, every 3 years you need to be reevaluating your students with a 504 plan, okay? Reevaluating. Now that also goes for what we call a significant change in placement. This is not required under IDA. What is a significant change of placement? Could it be transitioning from elementary to middle? Maybe. Middle to high, high to graduation. Maybe they've been remanded to an alternative school for a disciplinary issue. Is that a significant change of placement? All of those are true, yes. So if you're in an elementary setting, a middle setting, high setting, if you time it just right from when they were originally evaluated, you potentially could get them on the track to do it right before they're getting ready to transition to middle and right before they're getting ready to transition to high. But please keep in mind, before any significant change of placement, and this is not going from kindergarten to first grade, or, Johnny was in my class and now I had too high of numbers, so we had to have another teacher come in. We're talking about placement, okay? Placement, okay? Transition services, not required. You know, under IDA, when a student turns 14 in the state of Tennessee, federally it's mandated at age 16 that they have to be a part of the process, don't they? They have to be invited to their meetings, they have to come, and they have to start advocating, so we know where they want to go post-secondary. That is not required under 504. Now, between you and me, would I start asking the parents and my team if it's appropriate that the student comes to learn how to advocate? Yes. Do 504s go with students to college? This is always a really fun question to ask because I see a lot of head shaking yes, I see a few shaking no. They do not go. The day they walk across the stage or they age out, the IEPs and the 504 plans are done. What's not done though is they have to independently walk into the Disability Resource Office, because I think as Dr. Wilson and her colleague noted earlier that parents typically, unless this kid signs consent, they don't get to talk to anybody at the university level. They have to go into the Disability Resource Office that every public institution will have, and they have to do what? They have to say, I have a disability and I need accommodations. Now, the Disability Resource Office is probably going to ask for something. They'll probably ask for a copy of a 504, an IEP, or an evaluation. Every institution is different in what they will require, and it's the institution that gets to decide what the student receives, okay? So when parents come to you and say they need a 504 so they can go into college and get extended time, no they don't, okay? No they don't. The university, the school is going to make that determination as to what they get. And as somebody who taught at a university, I had a fantastic disability resource office at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and very rarely was it extended time. They would be able to test in the disability resource office, but it was the same time constraints. They may have a note taker for their child to have somebody to take notes. But in terms of changing grades, lessening assignments, that was never a part of it, okay? So transition services, that's why I think it's important, even though it's not required, when the student turns 14 maybe, to start having them come and talk about what accommodations are you using? Because sometimes they don't access their accommodations, do they? What accommodations would you like to see? What would you need to support yourself? If they can't do that then, they're probably not going to be able to do that once they get into an independent setting where they're going to have to do it on their own. An IEE, some of you may or may not know what this is. It's an independent educational evaluation. Under IDA, anytime I evaluate a student, any evaluation, I could just give a cognitive test, and the parent disagrees, the school district, if they request it, would have to pay for an independent educational evaluation at no expense to the parent to have another assessment by a person of their choice, okay? That is not the same under 504. If they disagree with your evaluation, which we'll talk about in a second, we're going to talk about the process for them to file either grievance or due process. They don't get to have a free assessment on the school's dime, okay? Parental involvement, this is always a shock to people. There are a few instances where parents are required for 504, but they are not required team members. IDA is different. They are required team members. We have to do our due diligence to have them participate, but under 504, they're not. Okay? So as we start to talk about when parents have to be involved, it's really around some consent pieces, but for the purpose of attending just an annual 504 meeting, they're not required, okay? But certainly encourage, please try to have parents attend. I would recommend, if you don't have this slide deck, take a picture of this, have this next to you when you're in your support team meetings to know when to go right for 504 and maybe when to go left under IDA. This is the definition of what specially designed instruction is out of IDA. And we know that students who qualify under IDA, they meet the criteria and they have an adverse impact to their educational performance because they require specially designed instruction. So when you're sitting in your support team meetings, I'm assuming most of you probably lead those or have a part of those, and your teachers are talking about adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction for that student, that's probably an IDA evaluation, okay? Just sitting at the front of the classroom, maybe you're having to do some checks for understanding, maybe you're having to prompt the student to get through maybe several different tasks. We're not talking about adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction there, are we? No. But as soon as you start to ask your teachers, well, what are you doing in your ELA class right now? Well, we're reading this. Well, is that student able to keep up with grade level standards in class? Well, kinda, but I have to pull him to my table and I have to do an additional lesson that is on his instructional level, and then I have to adapt the materials because it's way above his vocabulary level, and he's in this level of RTI intervention every day. I have to do the same across content areas. Now we're doing a lot above and beyond, okay, for that student. That's when we're starting to talk about adapting the content, methodology, delivery of instruction. It probably should start with an IDA evaluation. If the student doesn't qualify, now you're back in 504 land, and you can use those results to make your judgment about a 504, okay? So I would have this next to you. So as you're talking to your teachers, are you having to adapt the content? Pause. Are you having to adapt the methodology? Are you having to adapt the delivery of instruction? If any of those are yes, I would stop that meeting and say, I think that this needs to go over to your special ed side of things, okay? What are your obligations? You know that you have child find obligations. You need to, that is really hard to see, that blue, isn't it? Evaluate free and appropriate education, LRE, least restrictive environment. We talk a lot about LRE and under IDEA. It also applies to Section 504. There's a lot of overlap. Okay, a lot of overlap. And then procedural safeguards. If you use EdPlan or Easy IEP system, it has the procedural safeguards in there, but not all of our districts use it, do they? Does anybody not use Easy IEP for 504? Good news is, with our new adoption of through our RFP process, Easy IEP now will be accessible for all students for 504 plans. It won't be an additional add-on for districts, which is a huge win for me. So I can have better support and accountability across the district. So let's talk about Child Find. It is your obligation, your district's obligation, to find those students that have disabilities in your schools. Often what happens is schools create policies or procedures where it's the parents' requirement to come and tell them they have some type of physical or mental impairment. It is not the parent's obligation, it's the district's obligation. That's why it's critical that if your teachers know something, see something, they do something about it, okay? Also, that you need to notify parents of their rights under Section 504, including their rights to grievance and or due process. Right? Most of you guys will have 504 policies in your district. If you have never seen your 504 policy, please go read that, because you guys are working under that policy umbrella, and you really need to understand your own internal policies, procedures, because they could be different district to district. So make sure you know what those are. They're supposed to be posted to your district's website. You must evaluate prior to making the student eligible. This is where districts go awry, because all the time we see where Mrs. Johnny's mom brings this documentation and says, here, my child's been diagnosed with all of this stuff. He needs a 504 plan, and the district turns around and creates a 504 plan off of that. We're going to talk about why that's going to be a problem for you. Okay? You must evaluate, and it's in your best interest to do a good, comprehensive evaluation prior to determining eligibility. Here are the two times that parents must be involved. Initial consent. If you are attempting to obtain initial consent for the parent to do a 504 evaluation, and the parent says, no, I don't want that. Are you done? You're done. You're going to document it, though. Please document. Please document, right? But you're not required to chase after them and try to convince them, okay? And then prior to initial provision of services. So essentially your first 504 plan, they got to sign off on whatever services, supports you're providing. And then after that, in perpetuity, you're good. You're going to try to have parent participation. Please don't just stop inviting them. But they shouldn't be a barrier to you still serving that student if they have already signed off on these two things. This would be similar to the initial consent evaluation form for IDA and then the first IEP. Same thing, okay? Here's the difference though too. Under IDA, a school district, if a parent refused to sign consent for me, I could take the parent to court, right? And force their hand. Do you want to know how many districts do that in the state of Tennessee? ever? Big old goose egg, okay? Because it's a lot of money. So if parents are not going to be active participants in this process, you document that they failed to provide consent, you've given them a number of opportunities to do so and they haven't, and you've given them their procedural safeguards so if they ever change their mind, they know what their obligations and what their duties are, okay? But these are the 2 times parents have to be involved. Now, I just mentioned about why you have to evaluate. So Johnny's mom brings you this slip of paper saying he's been diagnosed with ADHD inattentive type, okay? These are the 3 questions your evaluation has to answer. Do they have a disability under Section 504? Does the prescription pad tell me that? Yeah. Does it tell me what the student's educational needs are? Probably not. Does it tell me how it substantially limits one or more major life activities? Probably not. Because typically, when you get that doctor's note, look at them closely the next time because you'll laugh when you see this. It'll say what that disabling condition is, whatever that DSM criteria, whatever they're billing for. That's what happens. When they diagnose, they can bill, okay? It's connected. So the next thing is going to say prognosis. What does prognosis mean? Outcome. How is this going to impact the student? Almost always, it's just going to say good right there. All right? That's good evidence for you to have, but it also doesn't answer questions 2 and 3. Your evaluation has to fill in those gaps. What information would you need for a student who has ADHD to know their educational needs and then also know how it substantially limits one or more major life activities? Now, certainly, teacher input is going to be important, observations potentially, but you may want to do some things above and beyond that, especially if you already know the parent is going to be requesting, extended time or a read aloud. Now let's think through some pieces that you may want to collect during this time. Is it appropriate that you ask your school psychologist to do some things for you? And by the way, I've already trained the majority of our state school psychologists on this. Some of them were not as happy with me as I thought they would be. But we are absolutely able and legally able to evaluate any student. Now what you're going to hear in your buildings, so email me if they say this, I am IDA funded, I'm special ed, I can't evaluate a gen ed student. Do you ever hear that? Every kid we originally evaluate is a gen ed student. Okay? There's even provisions in the law under Section 504 and IDA that say anybody in your buildings, even an SLP, OT, PT that is paid under federal funds, they can evaluate any student. Now, providing services is a different story, okay, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I can evaluate or be a part of that evaluation with consent. So let's say you needed you got the ADHD diagnosis, but you don't know really how this impacts that student. Maybe I'm going to do some ADHD rating scales with the parent and the teacher and maybe even with the student, right? Absolutely can do that. Maybe we're going to collect all their benchmark data, their progress monitoring data, couple that and kind of triangulate that with other data we have to really see, do they need extended time? No, they do quite well when they're under a time constraint. Here's where a lot of districts go wrong is where parents come to these meetings, you have your evaluation, you say, okay, they meet criteria, you start to build out your plan, and I've seen this, so you can giggle if it's true. They hand them the book of all the accommodations and they say, pick some. And then the parent picks some, but we don't really know how or what the student needs we're not giving them an education comparable to non-disabled peers, and then we throw about 75 accommodations at that poor gen ed teacher. That's not reasonable for anybody. You got to come to that meeting with sufficient evidence through your evaluation and then make those recommendations to the parent. I'm going to tell you some good news in a moment. There's 3 reasons why a parent under 504 can file due process or grievance. The plan is not one of them. So if you don't put in one of the accommodations, the plan is not one of them, okay? What they can file due process or a grievance about is your evaluation. So you gotta make sure on the front end, you're doing your due diligence to collect what you need. If that's looping in me, maybe that's looping in your speech and language pathologist, OT, PT, could be any of those, okay? It could be your reading specialist in your building, your math coach. Whoever that needs, who needs to be a part of that, it could be your school nurse who's a part of that process. Whomever you need to have at the table to make evaluation decisions, do that. Because on that end, it's gonna protect you in the long run, okay? But any decision you make about that plan should always be grounded in data. What we don't wanna hear is, I don't think that Johnny needs that. I don't feel that Johnny needs that. I don't believe that Johnny needs that, right? We use a lot of those feeling words when we're making recommendations, but it's not grounded in data, okay? So often I hear from, I was doing this training out in West Tennessee, we had about 8 different small school districts come together, and I had a great question from somebody who was like, well, how do you know, really, if a kid needs read aloud? Well, how do you know? What if, through your evaluation process, you collected some data that shows the difference in how they perform when they are read aloud versus when they're not? For some kids, being read aloud to is miserable, isn't it? I know I had one kid, when I was a school psychologist still practicing, I would help out with administering the TCAP, right? Which, being told that you have to read aloud the entire TCAP to kids, first, it's horrible for that person, but then on top of that, it's worse for the kids. Because the majority of the time, if you're really watching them, you're reading, and then they go back and they have to reread, right? For some of our kids, it is absolutely imperative they have read aloud. So what if we test listening comprehension? If they score low in listening comprehension, are we gonna think about read aloud? Why would that be helpful to that student, right? So we really need to dig into what measures we're using. Maybe you're going to put a text in front of them and have them read aloud, answer some questions. Then you're going to give them another text that has similar vocabulary where you have them read independently and then compare and contrast. Go back to their progress monitoring probes. Look at their fluency measures. We often assume that every kid with an attentional issue needs extended time. No, they don't. We also need to make sure, is the kid, when given extended time, using it? Have the teacher set up some simulations in their class. All right, everybody, we're gonna start this assessment. I'm gonna start the timer, okay? And then see if they need more time above and beyond, and how do they score compared to their other non-disabled peers if you do or don't give them extended time. If it's comparable, we're not giving them more, we're trying to make that education comparable. Okay? So your evaluation must answer those 3 questions. What are you bound to do with your evaluation? You're supposed to have a variety of sources. Is a prescription note a variety of sources? No. Not just from teacher. Not just from parent. We need to have all of our stakeholders at the table to be able to bring in a variety of information on that student. The evaluation must be tailored to the specific needs of that child, okay? And then obviously we need to make sure that we're administering assessments that are valid and being used for the purpose that they were, initially developed, okay? Results must be documented. If you use Easy IEP, there's a part where you get down to the major life activities and you check on one of the major life activities and it asks you to rate them, doesn't it? And you have to have a 4 or 5, which 4 is, I think is it 4 substantially? You have to have either a 4 or 5, and then when you click those boxes, there's something on the right side that opens up that says justification. Please put in what you collected to justify that 4 or 5. That's your way to document without having to write what we call like a psych report. If you don't put any justification there, where do you document the findings from your evaluation? If it's not living there, you got to have something that brings it all together that documents that, okay? Because again, I told you that parents could file due process or a grievance against your evaluation. If you just say, well, my evaluation's up here, it's not going to fly. You got to have something formal on paper that documents what you did, okay? And I recommend, instead of having to do a separate document, because let's be honest, you guys don't have time for that, put those justifications in those boxes, okay? All significant factors must be considered, all right? So when we think about all significant factors, not just of the child, but think of all those major life activities that could be impacted. Sometimes we often just go to the thinking, the learning major life activity, as opposed to looking at communication, walking, running, all those other pieces. We need to make sure that we're considering all of those. So if that student requires accommodations or supports in those areas, we've already done our due diligence to assess in those pieces. Okay? And then again, you need to, with your teams, ensure that you have enough information to make a good determination. That's critical, okay? You have to have enough information. I always recommend that direct observations are a part of your evaluation. Informal input is great, but until somebody has their eyeballs on the kid and can actually see them in the classroom, because sometimes our teachers say, well, he's doing this, X, Y, and Z every single day. Well, then you go in and you may not see the exact same thing, but you may see different information that the teacher hasn't even seen yet, okay? We need to make sure that somebody has their eyeballs on the kid, whether it's you. Principals can be a part of this process. If they're already doing their team evaluations, just have them go in and say, hey, I need you to look and give me some notes back on this student, okay? Your school site can do that. Your coaches in your building can do that. A lot of times that's what they're doing. They're already out in the classrooms. Have them take some notes on a specific kid's level of engagement. That will be really helpful to know how often they are staying on task with what the teacher's doing, okay? So bring in who you need to bring in as you're thinking through these evaluations. So who is made up of your team? Okay, so we see Section 504 coordinator, you, okay, principal LEA, and then professionals knowledgeable about the student as needed, okay, as needed. So we should have at least 3 people in that room, okay, at least 3 people. I get this question a lot. Should the 504 coordinator and the LEA be the same person, or can they be? We don't recommend that. They have different functions, and you don't want to put yourself in a really uncomfortable situation, whereas the LEA, especially if you're talking about a manifestation determination meeting, where you're having to make the final decision, but you're also functioning as a 504 coordinator. And 2, you guys have typically the best relationships with parents. You don't want to be in that LEA situation if you can avoid it, okay? Again, highly encouraged to invite parents. Absolutely understand if they're not there, but you need to ensure that the people at the table have knowledge of that student, right? We see in IDA that they'll bring in the gym teacher sometimes to serve as, the general education teacher, and they just know them out of a group of 120 kids. Not as problematic necessarily, but in this case, you have to have professionals who are knowledgeable about that student. Do they have a disability? We're going to answer those questions. You're going to go through those 3 questions with your team, okay? What is an impairment? You guys, this is not an exhaustive list. When I do this training, typically it is 3 hours, 3.5 hours usually, and we really dig into some of these pieces. We're not asking you to do that because, as I told you before, there's a pretty low bar, and we can cover any of these. If you're not familiar to organic brain syndrome is, in my opinion, a fairly outdated term, but those are looking at Alzheimer's, dementia, those types of things, okay? Neurological in origin, but that are having impacts on memory and then other cognitive processes, okay? So any of these could be covered, all right? Is not, again, an exhaustive list that we're looking at. So every decision should be on a case-by-case basis based on what that parent or teacher is saying, okay? Now, when we think about major life activities, if a parent brings something to you and says that they have diabetes and they have documentation of that, we can answer the first question. Now we need to be able to answer 2 and 3, educational needs, and then how does it substantially limit? Does diabetes affect walking? It could. Seeing? It could. Speaking, learning, working, communicating, concentrating. I'm reading the screen in the back, so you guys are probably wondering why my eyes are going crossed. Eating, sleeping, standing, lifting. Could it impact all of those? Potentially. So we have to know more. Maybe if your school nurse is a part of the process, they can help read through the doctor's report and flesh some of that out. Or maybe you just get consent from the parent to be able to talk to the doctor or the nurse practitioner directly. So you can actually ask, what are these areas that are going to be impacted? If she just needs to be able to go get her insulin checked, or she needs to be able to have a snack, or she needs to maybe take breaks if she gets too fatigued, maybe the nurse can tell us that, right? But if not, we may need to do some direct observation, right? Having the student report out, okay, in 15 minutes into this class lecture, how are you feeling, okay? do some additional evaluation if you need it to be able to address all of these scenarios, right? And just don't assume either, because I think that's what happens, especially if we go back here and think around ADHD. We just assume concentrating. There could be a lot of other major life activities that could be impacted with attentional issues. So please make sure you're collaborating with your teams. I'm certainly not asking you guys to be an expert in all mental and physical impairments. You guys will probably gain a very good level of expertise in this field, but that's why you have your psychologists there. Your school social workers can be involved. School nurses, any of those folks can absolutely be a part of your 504 process. Again, substantial limitations, case-by-case basis. The critical piece here, it doesn't mean that they can't do it. And often people think, well, I had a student who had a pretty severe concussion after a car accident. He was going to be in a wheelchair for better part of a year and was going to need some PT services, OT services at the school building. He did not qualify under IDEA, so we went with a 504. And it doesn't mean that he won't be able to walk again, he won't be able to navigate the building, he won't be able to toilet independently and all those things, but right now, he can't, okay? So make sure that as you're talking through these things with your parents, it's not just about they can't do it, it just has a substantial limitation, okay? Talk about the condition, manner, and duration of this. How long is it gonna last? We got a lot of requests when COVID was happening to say, is COVID covered under 504? It was a good question. But transitory impairments are not covered, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, so talk about condition, manner, duration. Again, multiple pieces of assessment data. I'm going really fast because I know I'm going to run out of time. Okay, by the way, we are going to be hosting some more virtual trainings of 504. So depending on which districts that you're in, I can make sure that you guys get that information. We have been doing a really good job across the state with working with our special ed teams, our special ed directors. We're trying to improve around 504, okay? Trying to improve because we know it is such a big area. Is a medical diagnosis required? No. Where school districts go wrong and where they err is they require a medical diagnosis before they'll even consider a 504 plan. Don't do that, okay? It is our obligation to do child find, and if the team suspects a mental or physical impairment, we can do our due diligence to evaluate and to address it. The parents, certainly if they have a diagnosis, that is good information for us to have, but it is not required. And please don't require it of them, okay? Because that will get you in a load of hot water, okay? Do they automatically qualify? I see some you guys are star students here. No. A medical diagnosis doesn't automatically qualify them unless it substantially limits one or more major life activities. And so how do you know and what data do you have that is going to be able to address to say, do they have this impairment that substantially limits? There's nothing that's automatic under IDA or 504. It should always be grounded in team approach and data, always, okay? I know I meet bi-monthly with school psychs across the state virtually, and we had our talk yesterday, and we were talking around SLD because there's this rumor going around that every high school, any high school counselors in the room? I'm talking to you then. Every student with SLD in a high school setting has to be an intervention. And the problem is then because they can get some credits in intervention that they miss out on CTE or band or music or the things that actually keep them in school, right? And somebody mentioned, well, we thought that they were required. I said, that's like saying every student with autism has to be in a social skills group. It should always be based on the individual student and what the individual student needs, and there's nothing ever automatic under IDEA 504. So what data do we have to say that this intervention course would be the best fit for this student, right? Or could we provide support accommodations in the other core classes to ensure the student is successful? Mitigating measures. This one is a really interesting one. As of 2009, you'll see that there. I'm going to read this to you because it's a mouthful. School districts, in determining whether a student has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, must not consider the ameliorating effects of any mitigating measures. What the heck does that mean, April? So you can't consider any of the ameliorating effects. What does ameliorating mean? The lessening of, okay, of any mitigating measures. A mitigating measure is something that is kind of like an intervention. I don't put the list of mitigating measures up here for you, but I can happily share those with you after this session. Let me give you an example. Johnny's being evaluated for ADHD. About 4 weeks into the evaluation, teacher comes to you and says, Johnny is a new kid. He came in today, he sat down, he had his materials, he did what I asked of him, he didn't talk back, he paid attention, he participated. I think he has gone through an exorcism, okay? And you call the parent because you're curious too, and the parent says, oh, I forgot to tell you, about 2 weeks ago we saw our physician and he put Johnny on some psychostimulant to help him with his ADHD. Obviously, a lot of those medications take a few weeks to kick in, and now he's a brand new kid. But you're in the middle of your evaluation. When you get to eligibility, do you consider Johnny pre-medication or post-medication? We are not allowed to consider the ameliorating effects of any mitigating measures. Medication is a mitigating measure. So you consider Johnny pre, don't you? And if you have the 504 plans in EasyIP, you'll know that there's a little tab at the bottom that talks about the, I think it's called eligible, what is it called? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? It's the not temporarily eligible, I'm losing the word. Yes, technically eligible. That is a 504 term, thank you. Technically eligible, meaning he qualifies, right? But he may not need accommodations because of those mitigating measures. So he's technically eligible, and if mama stops giving him the meds, because that never happens, right? Johnny stops taking the meds even though his mama thinks he's taking the meds, or mama doesn't refill the prescription, or any of those other reasons that could happen, now we have the 504 plan in place and we can meet again as a team if we need to include those accommodations, okay? So think of Johnny pre. That's what happens a lot. It even happens in IDA. Answered an email recently from a special ed director saying, we are evaluating a student for OHI, ADHD. He started taking medication. He doesn't need anything. Ugh. Even under IDA, we cannot consider those mitigating measures. Other mitigating measures would be prosthetics, wheelchair, right? Assistive technology. Maybe they need a communication device to be able to communicate, okay? The only difference would be eyeglasses. So if they had just regular eyeglasses, that's not considered a mitigating measure. But if they had a true vision, hearing impairment, that would be different. What can go into a 504 plan? Anything. This is always a stumper for people. Can a student under a Section 504 plan receive speech and language services? Yep. Can they receive OT, PT, nursing? Yep. Can they ride the special education bus? Absolutely. Remember, it's about access. If you take your kids on a field trip and you need the special education bus because you have a student who, my kid that had the car accident, needs to have a special education bus because that bus can pick him up in his wheelchair to get him to the field trip, do you have to provide it? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Be cautious. There's a little, I don't know if you guys keep up with case law, probably not as much as I do, I just find it intriguing. There's been cases all across the country where students have been left out of things, refused to participate, refused to be allowed because people assume that they can't do it based on their disability. So again, anything can go into a 504 plan, right? The only thing that we're not going to talk about are what we say those direct services. Special education teacher coming into the classroom and working with that student, a special education teacher pulling that student out for work on English or math, right? But a one-on-one could be written into a 504 plan. Please talk to your district leadership before you do that. Don't tell them April said you could do that. Please talk to your district leadership about the related services, because as I mentioned before, depending on how people are paid in your district, they may not be able to provide the services for that person. Okay, so if they're IDA funded, if they're funded federally, let's say I'm an SLP and I'm funded federally, I could test the kid, I can't serve the kid because I'm paid with federal funds. Does that make sense? Okay, so talk to your leadership about any of these, especially the ones that are going to require some additional funding behind the related services, transportation, nursing, one-on-one aid, those types of things. Okay, some other considerations. I'm going to try to still get done in the same amount of time because I know you guys are starving. Okay, bullying, harassment. I was just out of school this past week in Rutherford County. As I walked in, the principal says, I'm going to need to kind of postpone what we're talking about because I'm investigating a bullying situation. If you know about bullying harassment, should you do something about it? Please don't do nothing. Please don't do nothing. And if you're not the person to do it, I would put it in writing to the person who does. I have been notified today by this student, by this teacher, by this parent that this is occurring, and I would make sure you save a copy of that email that you notified the powers that be, whether that's your principal, your assistant principal, whoever is that person in your building, and make sure you know who that person is, okay? Please don't sit on this. When we know students are being bullied or harassed, it is not only potentially a state issue, federal issue, right? It is a legal issue. And so this could be from teacher to student, okay? Or it could be student to student. The whole adage of kids will be kids, boys will be boys doesn't fly anymore, folks. It doesn't fly anymore. So make sure that you're addressing those things as they come to you. And if you have knowledge of it, do something about it. Tell somebody. If you see something on social media, now that's the big piece. Well, it started outside of school. It has nothing to do with school. But guess what they're going to bring it to? They're going to bring it to school. Okay? So make sure that you have mechanisms for reporting that and investigating that. That is the biggest issue now, that we're getting so many complaints at the state level about bullying and harassment and retaliation. Okay? So make sure that you are talking to your leadership as you think through these, especially, I would say not so, I know it happens at elementary, but middle and high, you guys just live in that world, don't you? You just live in that world. Please make sure you're documenting and you're investigating each of these situations. Again, access. There was a case, I believe it was out of New England area, where a little girl with Down syndrome tried to join the cheerleading squad. And they didn't even let her try out. Whew. Not good, is it? Now, let's say she tried out and she didn't meet the criteria to join. Is that different? Yeah. Student with disability comes to you and tries to join the baseball team. Can you hold them to the same standard that you are holding other baseball tryout tees? I don't know what you call them. Tryout tees? I just made up a word. Tryout? Anyways, you can hold them to the same standard, but you got to give them the access to try. Okay, you got to give them the access to try. And I've already given you those examples about the field trips, but this is where you guys, especially in collaboration with your admin, because they're the ones who approve all those field trips, even if you go, there was one situation where they went to, I think it was some type of museum, but it was an indoor-outdoor experience, and the student could only access part of the building because of access, and when the building was built, could be a problem. Okay, could be a problem. Make sure that the student has access to all of those different areas and benefits from those services, supports, just like any other typical peer. Individual health plans. They should not serve as a substitute for a 504 plan. You guys have students in your building with individual health plans? A lot of them have them, but what we do and what we caution, okay, you'll notice that we had some attorneys look at my PowerPoint here, because the last bullet says, if you are in the practice of placing students on individual health plans in lieu of considering a 504 plan, you should revisit your practice. Legally, that means stop doing it, okay? So if you have students who are on individual health plans right now and you've never considered a 504, I'm telling you, you should consider it, okay? And if an individual health plan is appropriate, let me give you an example. Maybe a student who's deathly allergic to bees, okay? Maybe a 504 plan could be appropriate. Maybe they need to have a nurse with them at all times, maybe. But if it doesn't rise to that level of severity, but they just need to have an EpiPen, maybe that's just an individual health plan. But case-by-case basis, case-by-case basis. Oh, absolutely. Great question. She asked if it was appropriate to mention the individual health plan, the IHP, in the 504. Absolutely. Those documents can be married to each other, okay? And you can say, in case of emergency, this is, refer to the IHP, however you want to do that. Is there anything saying that the IHP has to be there? Because the 504 could serve in that function. I just know that a lot of our school nurses and folks, they like that document because it asks really specific questions that our 504 doesn't capture. But there's nothing that's saying, because if IHP isn't a legal document, right? 504 is, so it holds more weight than the IHP. So just talk through with your teams what's appropriate, but just make sure that you're considering if a 504 is appropriate in some of those cases. I've had, I was out modeling, we had a state-run school who had a 504 coordinator in for like 30 years in the school, and then he retired. So they had a brand new school counselor right out of school, okay, who was taking over, and they had all hard copy forms. They had nothing digital. So I went out, walked through forms, did some training, modeled some meetings, sitting around a table, and the student had some type of gastrointestinal Crohn's. I think she was a senior, she was on track to graduate, was gonna go to Tennessee Tech, on all this. And the teacher's like, we're gonna do this for the students. I mean, we're gonna let her go to the bathroom. We don't need to have this plan, it's just more meetings for us. Would you like a really great example of why that's not always the case? Working in a high school, when I was a school psychologist, student did not have a 504 plan and had gastrointestinal issues. Asked the teacher if she can use the restroom. The teacher declined, said, no, we're in the middle of a lesson, you can't go. She asked her 3 more times. The student proceeded to stand up and try to run out of the room. She ended up defecating on herself. She's in high school, folks. Can you imagine the social implications for that? Because the teacher said, no, you can't go to the bathroom. It just takes one time for somebody to not follow a plan. And I always joke, I said, everything's fine until it's not fine. And so every teacher, and I know teachers in their hearts are gonna do what's right by kids, but then you have that one that says, you can't eat in my room because I had ants last year. Or you can't do this because this, right? And it takes one kid for that to happen to, and then it's gonna be a problem, okay? So I rather just on the front end, it may be more meetings, it may be more time, protect yourself, protect your school, protect the kid, right?
One of my administrators said, I don't understand why that bathroom thing is on 504 if they already have this IHP, and that's why I asked that question, because they were saying, that's not appropriate, and I was like,
Yep.
I don't think that's right, but I'll find out.
No, that's a great question. And if you didn't hear that virtually, she just asked about, they had the bathroom access on IHP, but then the teacher was curious why it was living on the 504 plan as well, and that's why, is because the IHP is not a legal document. 504 is, okay? 504 is, just like an IEP. And that's where some people are like, oh, an IEP holds more legal weight. Not really. They both hold the same amount of legal weight. They had the same punitive consequences that could come from either side. And teachers should be following a 504 plan in the same manner they would follow an IEP. Again, extracurricular and non-academics. This is where I like to talk about, can they be the same document? So I just got this question this week. I actually have been asking this a lot. I feel like we have advocates across the state who are now saying, I want an IEP for a specific learning disability, and then I want a 504 for ADHD. Is it necessary? No, no. An IEP, remember our circles, is essentially a 504 plan, okay? So if you have that circumstance under the medical information, you could put either child has a mental or physical impairment, substantially limits, you can name it what it is, characteristics of dyslexia, whatever you want to call it, characteristics of ADHD, okay? And then put the accommodations in where you put the accommodations in. That's fine. The other piece of that is at the IEP section, not the very last page, not the signature page, but the page before that where it's talking about ESY, you probably are familiar, ESY, LRE, homeschool, and access to non-disabled peers. That's where you can talk about if you need supports during baseball, or if you go on field trips, or if the student is attending this club but they need the school nurse there, right? That's the section you can talk about that in, is that last page of that IEP. Now, if somebody pushes and says, no, I really want this to be separate, is that okay? Yeah, it's just more meetings for everybody, right? Check your board policy, though. There are a few districts across the state that they refuse to allow them to have separate documents. Check your board policy, okay? But there's nothing wrong with that. They can certainly do that. Again, it's just more work for you. It's more work for your teachers. It's more work for your principal. And it's certainly more work for the parent. Okay? Contact information. I want to say one other thing because I did not talk about that as I was going through. By the way, this is Chandrea Hersey. She is our Assistant General Counsel for Civil Rights. She and I usually do a lot of these trainings as a tag team because she comes at it from the legal perspective and I come at it from the programming perspective. But the only piece of this that I didn't lean into was initial consent and timeline. How many days do you have to complete your initial evaluation for a student with a 504 plan? Or not with a 504 plan, to see if they are eligible for a 504? It doesn't say, does it? It says a reasonable time frame. So where there's ambiguity, we lean into IDA. What does IDA require? 60 days, 60 calendar days, okay? So 60 days to get that initial evaluation done.
But if your district has a policy that says 20 days or whatever, you have to follow the district policy?
If your district, yes. Follow your district policy. 20 days is not reasonable.
No.
That's not reasonable for me to do. And no, that's not reasonable. But again, IDEA leans into that. Now, I didn't mention either, I didn't have this because, again, I have like a minute before our time's up. Those 3 buckets of what a parent could file due process or a grievance procedure on. Again, look at your district policy because they're going to have the grievance policies in their due process. Certainly, they can file an OCR complaint with Chandrea. There's just been a huge uptick of those folks, just to let you know. And if you've ever been through, has anybody ever been through an OCR complaint? They are much more intensive than a due process under IDEA. They're bad. All right. So if we could avoid one at all costs, that would be great. But parents have 3 buckets of which they can disagree. That evaluation is one of them. Okay. The identification is the other. So child find, you didn't find them when you should have found them. Okay. Or they didn't qualify. The evaluation in and of itself, and then essentially the initial placement, where you put them. Okay. Because students could technically be served in different placements under 504.
What is OCR?
Office of Civil Rights. I'll say one more thing, and I'll get you your questions because I want to give you a few minutes, because I know you have them. So you remember going back to the plan of itself. If you say we don't have the data to support a read aloud, can the parent file due process on that? No. Can they file due process if you don't put in extended time? No. But please have the data to fight back if they do file about the eval. Because if you never figured out if you needed to assess and what you use to make that determination, that's going to be a problem, okay? But parents, again, don't give them the opportunity to pick and choose. I can tell you so many examples of parents calling me saying, well, they told me I could choose, and then the next year, guess what? They were like, well, they don't really need any of this, and then they undid what the parent did, and then you get the parent upset. Make sure you have data. Parent participation is recommended, but your data should drive all of that. Okay, sorry, what was your question?
Are school counselors generally part of 504s? Because I have never been included in 504.
You are probably. Let me repeat that question. If any, I'm assuming they heard her. She asked, to what extent are school counselors typically involved in 504? It is every district's decision. There's nothing at the state level that requires school counselors to be involved. So you may have somebody else in your district who's leading that work. Yay, you! And everybody is giving you stink eyes right now. If you could only see their faces. I would say by and large across the state of Tennessee, it is school counselors who are doing that work. I know in other states, sometimes it's the school psych who does it. Sometimes it's an assistant principal. Sometimes it's a lead teacher. But it is a district decision on who does that work. Good question. Yeah?
2 questions. One real quick. I hope that student, I didn't know if you knew if there was a follow-up with her and not being able to use the restroom, if she ended up okay. I was just like hoping that
You know, that was a really hard situation. We
Yeah.
tried to do some restitution there and have a really, I would say, difficult conversation, a crucial conversation with her to rebuild the relationship. But, you know, some teachers, that's their kingdom, that's their classroom. What I say goes, and we could not find any good resolution there. So at my recommendation, we did move that student out of that classroom.
the second part of that was I noticed that you said nursing services, or it's under 504. Does that count for, or what does that entail with like administering medication? Like if it's a medication you have to give the student, do they go to the nurse's office? Is it administered in the office? That sort
Typically,
of
yes.
Okay.
Any medications that are going to be under lock and key in the nurse's office, if parents sign off that the nurses can administer those, then yes.
But the counselor, the teacher.
So there are some circumstances, let's say the nurse is out sick or something, there's always typically a secondary, even sometimes a tertiary person who is approved to administer medicines. I would never make that you. Okay, if you can avoid that, I would never make that you. But parents need to sign consent for all of that, yes. Now, in emergency situations, if they're, the student needed an EpiPen or you needed to administer CPR, I'm trying to think of, do what you need to do to protect the kid and yourself, but yes, nurses can administer. Yes.
We have a question online.
Okay.
Would you please, they would like clarification on a student who is protected even without a plan?
Oh, thank you. Good question. So if we say that a student has that diagnosis, but we do our evaluation and it doesn't substantially limit one or more major life activities, they are still protected under that anti-discrimination law. Okay, so can't be discriminated against, still needs access for other things, even if they don't have the plan. Now, I will say, is that probably going to be a rare occurrence? Probably, but you still need to be aware that if the student has that disabling condition, even if it doesn't rise to the level of 504 IEP, they are still protected by those. That includes the bullying and harassment piece. So and that should be any student in your building if there's bullying and harassment going on, but certainly make sure the students with disabilities are protected. Good question.
Last question. I'm in Clarksville, so what's our obligation for, I had a student who had a 504 and I called like 3 states. I finally found it. But how long and what's that transition technically reasonable?
Okay, so they moved to you and then they had a 504 and
Another state, and I had to find it because a couple of states didn't know. I finally did find
that
it.
is so murky. So I can tell you what IDA says. If you don't get those records, go ahead and get consent from the parent, go ahead and do your own evaluation, go ahead and start that process. If you have something that tells you what those comparable services would be, you can implement those at your own discretion. But if the parent just comes to you and says, well, they had a 504 in Wisconsin and they don't give you anything, then I would just start your process to get consent, do your own evaluation, determine eligibility, go from there. And if you do get that other document at some point, you still are obligated to make sure that they meet criteria. And often some states may have very, very low thresholds for who qualifies, and I would still just do your due diligence. But yeah, as soon as you have knowledge of that or you get that plan, if you're not already evaluating, I would go ahead and just implement those comparable services. Yeah, another question online?
Yes, we have another question online. Is a manifestation meeting required for a student with a 504 whose placement may be changed to an alternative school?
Excellent question. When I do this, the longer training, we talk a lot about manifestation determination meetings. Has anybody ever done an MDR? A couple people. MDRs are required for Section 504 students prior to a change of placement. Now, so if that student has, either it's a zero tolerance or they're going to be suspended, expelled for greater than 10 days, then an MDR meeting needs to be held to determine if that behavior had any direct substantial relationship to the student's disability. In IDA, we look at, was the IEP implemented as well? We don't ask that question in 504. Okay, it's not whether it was implemented. But yes, in that case, if they're going to be remanded to an alternative school, if MDR must be held prior to that change of placement. Yes.
Dr. Ebinger, we're going to wrap it up with that question.
Sounds good.
Wow, this is a jam-packed presentation. Thank you so much for this.